Qui animait la rencontre. Nous avons trois présentatrices aujourd'hui qui parleront pendant 40 minutes, ce qui nous laisse 20 minutes pour les questions et commentaires. So, veuillez noter que la séance sera en cours d'enregistrement. So I want to take some time to introduce the three speakers who will be speaking about, the title of it is a collaborative audio virtual tour of Holocaust survivors in post-war Montreal experiences. So the first invited presenter is Anna Sheftel. She's the Associate Professor and Principal of the School of Community and Public Affairs at Concordia University. She has a PhD in Modern History and a Master's in Forced Migration from the University of Oxford. She previously worked as an Associate Professor of Conflict Studies and was Vice Dean of the Faculties of Human Sciences and Philosophy at St. Paul University in Ottawa. Her field of expertise is oral history of genocide and atrocity, and she has done research projects on wartime memory in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the public testimonial practices of Holocaust survivors in
zut, c'est vrai, mon son marche plus.
Ok, mais moi ça marche. Okay. Recent projects have focused on Holocaust survivors who experienced sustained socioeconomic inequality in Canada, as well as the creation of a collaborative audio tour about Holocaust survivors' immigration to Montreal. She's published extensively on oral history, methodology, ethics, and pedagogy, with a focus on collaborative and community engaged practices and listening to difficult stories. Notable publications include Oral History Off the Record, Towards an Ethnography of Practice, published in 2013 by Palgrave Macmillan and co-edited with Stacy Zambrecki. And this won the Oral History Association's 2014 Book Award. And for her article, Talking and Not Talking About Violence, Challenges in Interviewing Survivors of Atrocity as Whole People, which won again the Oral History Association 2019 article award. Our second speaker is Eszter Andor. She's a commemoration and oral history coordinator at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and she works with Holocaust survivors who share their stories with students and give video testimony to the museum. Ms. Andor is also responsible for the museum's oral history collection, as well as the production of video material for its various projects. She organizes commemorations and other events that involve survivors too. Ms. Andor helped create the museum's Holocaust Life Stories website and the Building New Lives virtual exhibit produced by the Montreal Holocaust Museum for the Virtual Museum of Canada. Our third speaker is Nancy Rebelo. She teaches in the history department at Dawson College in Montreal. She's worked on various public history projects, including Project 55, a historical audio tour of ethnic communities on Saint Laurent Boulevard aboard Bus 55, and a walking tour called Memories of My Home, Memories of My Neighborhood, Cabot Square. These projects showcase the voices and memories of Montrealers, providing an intimate and untold history of the city's diverse communities and its neighborhoods. Given her interest in pedagogy, Ms. Rebelo has also worked on a number of initiatives that ensure student success within Dawson's social science program. And additionally, she's one of the coordinators for the college's annual Social Science Week conference. So please welcome our three speakers. Thank you.
Esther, do you want to?
We start? Yeah. I may have to ask help for sharing the video later on because my keyboard stopped working, but I kicked the cat out. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to Refugee Boulevard, so we're gonna talk about it maybe in a way that I'll try to describe some of it, and we're gonna show some clips from it. Refugee Boulevard, the walking app, showcases the stories of 6 war orphans, 2 girls and 4 boys, who arrived in 1948 in Montreal, and they set about rebuilding their lives in the Mile and Plateau Montreal neighborhood, which at the time was a very Jewish neighborhood. I won't go into too much of a context of the war in Europe because everybody knows that, but what's important in terms of survivor experience is that the end of war and liberation for them did not mean a return to normalcy, but a lot of new challenges and to really be able to start their life anew, go to another continent, which was expressed by at least one of them in our walking app who said that the main goal was to get out of Europe. However, most countries heavily restricted Jewish immigration, among them Canada. And not only because of anti-Semitism, but there was another element in the post-war world is that they consider these people somehow broken or damaged, and they were afraid of the consequences of having these people in here. By the late 1940s, because of lobbying from the Jewish community, however, a number of survivors could settle in Canada, and Montreal became home to the 3rd largest survivor community outside of Europe. The survivors arrived through a variety of labor schemes, as tailors, furriers, domestic help, and often they were not really tailors and furriers, but they managed to get the papers and somehow pass the exams that allowed to come here, or they came through family sponsorship. We have examples of that too among our interviewees, or the War Orphan Project, and this is what our walking tour really concentrated on. Which was a project to bring 1,000 war orphans under the age of 18 to Canada. And in the end, they didn't even manage the 1,000, a little less than 1,000, 2/3 of which were boys and 1/3 girls. And over half of them, over 500 of them made Montreal their home. And what we found building this tour with them is that the relationships and friendships that they formed in these first few years were crucial in rebuilding their lives and finding their place here and kind of putting the experiences of the war and the losses behind them. Anna.
Thank you, Esther. So with that historical context, the project itself was a very long time in the making, which I think is important to highlight because it takes a lot of time to build this kind of capacity. And so in 2009, Stacy and I first started interviewing survivors as part of the Montreal Life Stories project at Concordia that I mentioned many of you have heard of, which was based at the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling, and which interviewed 500 Montrealers displaced by war, genocide, and other human rights violations. So we interviewed Holocaust survivors, other people interviewed survivors of the Rwandan and Cambodian genocide, and other refugees and immigrants who had come to Montreal fleeing violence. And in this project, Stacy and I already had started to write about this period and publish articles about this topic of survivors' post-war arrival in Montreal. But in 2018, Stacy came back to me and said, let's try something different rather than just thinking about sort of like traditional historical articles and tell these stories in a format that makes them more engaging for the general public, and that also centers survivor voices, which is a really important aspect of the tour. So the initial work that we started 12 years ago was especially interested in informal spaces that survivors created and used to make Montreal home. these kinds of places that they and only they knew, and places that are invisible to the archives. And we'll return to this point later in the talk. So we wondered, what more could we learn and be able to represent if we approached these stories with this focus on place that comes with an audio tour. And so we approached the project by thinking of the Holocaust survivor story as an immigrant story, one about arriving in Montreal, about learning and integration and socialization and remaking home. And this is, of course, not often how we conceptualize Holocaust survivor narratives. So it required a sort of shift in the framework that we use to think of survivors. And so when we first had the idea for this walking tour, we began by revisiting the Montreal Life Stories interviews, and then we reached out to survivors with whom we had longstanding relationships to conduct new multi-session interviews in their homes and in the neighborhood where they first settled. We interviewed in teams, and we asked questions about things like survivors' arrival in Montreal, their early memories of the city, their social lives, their hardships, their work, their marriage, and their education. These were often questions that our survivors had never been asked before, even though everyone we interviewed had been interviewed many times already. So they were sort of very practiced interviewees, but this was still new. And usually after a first session in their homes, if possible, we would bring survivors who were willing and able back to the old neighborhood. And often it had been years since they had visited the area to tell their stories in situ. So the project therefore mixes these old and these new stories, and this is one of the first challenges of doing the work. Our old interviews were of poor production quality, and they weren't as focused on these questions. So mixing old and new required some creativity, both in terms of the sort of conceptualization of the tour, as well as the actual technical work of stitching it all together. We were very lucky to work with a multimedia specialist who had done oral history audio tours before and understood what we were trying to do. So he helped us navigate what wasn't possible, and to clean up the old interviews and help make them fit. So our hope was to offer an effective physical experience for people who participate in the walk that invites you to share an intimate historical and narrative journey. It centers survivor voices, and you see the neighborhood through their eyes. While historical audio tours are all the rage right now, when we began conceptualizing the tour, we listened to some as our sort of background research, and we made one very conscious decision, which I think makes our tour unique. Many audio tours use people's stories to tell the story of a place. And our goal, we decided, was the inverse, to use the stories of the places to tell the story of the people. So some of the locations on the tour are historic buildings, like, for example, the old YMHA on Montreal Avenue, which is a beautiful and very visible historic building. Other locations on the tour are nothing spectacular, like an apartment turned into a restaurant that we'll talk about in a few minutes, or a bakery that sold cakes that reminded our survivors of home. And so again, the goal was that the places would tell us about the people. Once we were finished interviewing, to ensure that we all got to know our narrators and their stories, we held what we called listening parties. And this was all four of us, so myself, Nancy, and Eszter, as well as Stacy, who's not here. We'd get together and discuss each life story interview, and we listened to each and every clip that we'd identified together, deciding which ones to keep and which ones to cut for the tour. And this was a sort of challenging process because, again, with audio tours, you're trying to do two things at once. You're thinking about the more sort of conceptual academic side of things in terms of like, what is the substance of the story you're trying to tell, but you're also thinking very pragmatically about wanting to cut this down into an hour and have something that had the right pace. And, you know, academics are very verbose people. So the idea of like paring it down was a challenge. And so these parties, I mean, we spent a lot of time together listening, and they led us to make one important decision very early on, that because we wanted to get to know the people and make sure that they were the heart of the tour, we needed to limit how many different survivors one hears on the tour. So we interviewed more than 6, but the tour follows the lives of 7 of them, the 6 sort of interviewees and our narrator. We wanted listeners to really get to know them. And then when we tested the tour and sought feedback, and the tour was really extensively tested, I think Nancy in particular, her sort of exercise regimen for that spring and summer was just walking the path over and over again and making sure the timing worked and making sure it all fit. But when we sought feedback, we had this constant question to our listeners: do you feel like you got to know them? Were you able to differentiate between Paul and Tommy, or Ted and George, or Musha and Renata? And the goal was, even if you were only having very limited clips from hours of interview, that you'd still come away feeling like you had gotten to know these people and feeling like the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. When we've gotten feedback on the tour, this does seem to be what stands out: the sense of intimacy that you get from having this sort of one-on-one experience with these survivors. You download it onto your phone, you plug in your earphones, and you walk with them talking to you. It feels like they're talking to you and you alone. And then you're in these physical spaces that they're describing. And so it creates sort of relationship, like you have this individualized experience of listening and being in space, and of especially feeling like you are getting to know not just Holocaust survivors, but these specific people by walking in their footsteps. And it can be quite sort of emotional and affecting. It snaps us out of a lot of our preconceived notions of who these people really were and are, and it compels us to listen to their lives close up, in detail, relationally. So as you can see from what I'm describing, our collaborative approach was key. As a team, all the central decisions about the tour were made collectively and through consultation with each other. And more importantly, we partnered with the survivors to shape and choreograph the project's narrative and make sure that it was true to their memories. The clearest example of this was our work with Fischel Goldig, a child survivor who narrates the audio tour. So we decided early on that we wanted to have a survivor as a narrator, in contrast to the sort of standard documentary format in which you have an outside quasi-objective narrator that balances the first person subjective accounts. We approached Fischel, of course, because of his experiential knowledge, but also because he was a trained actor and he spoke both English and French. So he was both a survivor and a sort of professional who was qualified to do a narration. And then we sent him a script, which was very functional. It gave relevant historical background. It told people where to go and when to cross the street. And he immediately came back to us and said that this was his story too, and it had to be part of the tour. So we collaborated with him, going back and forth several times to rewrite the script until it worked for everyone, until it represented Fischel himself, as well as giving the historical background they needed and telling people when to cross the street. The result, if I can say so myself, is amazing. His voice is so compelling and it anchors the tour so meaningfully. And the result is an audio tour that is led exclusively by survivors themselves. It is their voices that guide participants through this neighborhood that was once theirs, but that is now gentrified and quite distant from that reality. And I'm going to just play one example of his narration, which shows this interplay between his personal experiences and his role as our guide. So let me try and share screen. And it's just a little minute clip.
The first few years of life in Canada were quite difficult. I was a survivor of the Holocaust, an immigrant in a new country who spoke neither English nor French. I moved into this neighborhood with my mother, who worked as a dress finisher, and my father, who worked in a rubber factory. Although I was big and strong and wanted to get a job to help out, my father would not hear of it. Instead, I was sent to study at Yeshiva Merkaz HaTorah High School. In the years following World War II, this area was a vibrant hub of Jewish life. This audio tour transports you back to that time through the stories of 6 Holocaust survivors who also arrived in 1948 and quickly set about remaking their lives here.
So I have to say, I never tire of listening to Fischel's voice. It's so compelling. And I really think that this is one of the most innovative aspects of the tour and part of what makes it so special. I'll pass it on to Nancy now.
So I'll build on some of the challenges that Anna has already mentioned. So
like any project, we faced some bumps along the road. And while initially these were perceived as strong challenges over time, and I think the end result of our project is obviously a stronger project. And some of the challenges that we faced, one of our, I'll speak about a number of challenges, but the first one will be what we tend to call as like too many cooks in the kitchen. We had many people invested in this project. So we had the survivors, we had Stacy, Anna, myself, the museum via Eszter. And so we all had a vision of what we wanted the project to be. We all had goals for this project. And in some cases, we had to kind of line up all of our visions and our goals. And that took quite a bit of negotiation. So in the terms, an example that Anna just mentioned was with Fischl. When we brought in Fischl, we had intended that Fischl would be the narrator. But Fischl too then became invested in this project and said, no, I'm not going to do this narration unless my story becomes part of this narration. And in the end, the project is much better because Fischl is integrated into the audio tour. He is not simply a narrator. He is integrated into the story of immigrating and settling and rebuilding. Another example that I can give you in terms of the challenges that we faced was related to the museum's requests for the project to be as bilingual as possible. We had initially intended that the audio tour would be in the language that it was spoken, that the interviews were conducted. And so these interviews were conducted in English. We envisioned that the tour would be in English, but that we would have a full transcript in French. And the museum pushed back. The museum said, no, we can't have this on our website unless we have a tour that can be listened to, at least in part, in French. And like all projects, there were constraints in terms of budget. We couldn't imagine dubbing the voices of the survivors. We couldn't imagine dubbing their stories. And so the compromise that we came to was that the narration by Fischl would be offered in French. And so we do have a French tour whereby the narration is in French, but the stories of the orphan Holocaust survivors are in the language that they spoke those stories. So those stories are in English. But we were so fortunate to have someone like Fischl, who was, not only as Anna mentioned, the trained actor and able to do this narration in English, but he was also, although a little bit hesitant, able to conduct, to record the narration in French. And so we ended up with two versions of our tour, which, in hindsight is obviously allows it to be much more accessible. And so we're very proud of that, although initially it posed challenges. A second main challenge that we had was actually finding interviewees, and especially when we think about a gender imbalance. So there were 525 orphans who settled in Montreal from the War Orphans Project. This may sound like a lot of people, a large sample with which to pick from, but the reality was that is that this was 70 years ago, and as a result, we struggled to find survivors who were well enough to be interviewed and even willing to be interviewed. So we also had to come to terms with a strong gender imbalance inherent in the War Orphans Project. Nearly double the number of orphans who came to Montreal were boys. Hence, we had fewer stories about this period from the girls' perspective. The two voices that we do hear in the tour, Nusha and Renata, from the girls' perspective, they were actually interviewed for the Montreal Life Stories project. And we could not re-interview these two women for this project because one, Renata had passed away, and Nusha, while she was still alive, she was not well enough to be interviewed. So so we did not have interviews of women that were conducted specifically for this project. And the challenges are that we're kind of lacking in terms of there's some gaps about the gender experience, about women's experience in the post-war period. There are questions that are left unanswered because those interviews that were conducted for the Life Stories project were not conducted with this idea of what was life like when you came here through the War Reference Project, settled in this neighborhood. What were your experiences? The stories that they do tell are often about the work that they that they did when they came here, about rebuilding, let's say, their family, their marriage. So they're kind of limited snapshots into what life was like for them. But we do not have the extensive story of their first few years here in Montreal. And so what we can say in terms of the limited stories that we do have is that the stories do indicate that the integration experience for young women was much more challenging, and that they did not experience the kind of liberty that is well described in the narratives of the male survivors. This is pretty clear in terms of the stories that are shared. The men have many stories of going out, meeting friends, dancing, lots of leisurely kind of stories, going to the movies. And the stories that we have from these two women that were interviewed for the Concordia Life Stories project are much more in terms of being kind of restricted in terms of their kind of freedom around the city. And I'll play a clip that will allow us to hear that. This is a clip from Renata.
Nancy, we don't hear anything.
Yeah, I'm trying to open it, and there we go.
Nancy, we still don't hear anything.
Okay, hold on.
Did you share sound when you?
I believe I did. Let's just check. Hold on. Sorry about that.
I was working as a domestic for a family, for a Jewish family. But actually they came from Russia, so I could talk to them. I wasn't much older than their own daughter, who treated me like garbage. Their friends would come and they said, who is that? Oh, that's our maid. I was completely isolated working there as a domestic. Was not a nice experience. The lady asked me one day, you are such a pretty young woman. I wonder how you survived. You probably flirted with the Germans, and I understand it was the war. So that was the attitude. If you survived, then you are scum. If you didn't, you're a victim, and that's it. And that was the attitude of Canadians. They just didn't have imagination. They didn't understand. I survived because I was lucky people helped me and my own courage. So that's why we didn't talk.
Now, in terms of other, so we can hear in that clip. I mean, I think that that's a very powerful clip in terms of showing this kind of gendered experience. But there are others. Musha talks about how when she settled at the hostel, that most survivors spent their first few nights there. That what we see is that families who came to take in or adopt or care for the orphans mainly came for the young girls, and the young boys were sent to live in apartments, and so they were kind of forced to kind of grow up a little bit faster, these young men, and these girls were taken into these homes. But as Misha talks about, many times they began to do kind of domestic work in the homes that they were taken into. Another challenge that we faced was undervalued post-war stories. Now, this is really interesting. One of the things that we noticed is that all of our interviewees are accustomed to sharing their Holocaust stories. Many of them are kind of professional storytellers. And naturally, the result is that they have this rehearsed kind of presentation. And there is also the idea of the importance of the Holocaust, the awareness work that has been done around the Holocaust. And so what happens was that when we went to interview our survivors, and when we told them that we wanted to interview them about the post-war period, about when they came to Montreal, they had a very difficult time switching to the post-war period. They had a very difficult time not speaking about their Holocaust experience. We often encountered questions like, so you don't want me to talk about the Holocaust? They were kind of unsure of what we wanted to hear, if not that story. And so what happened is that many felt it necessary, before being able to speak about their experience in Montreal, they would start with kind of this abbreviated history of the Holocaust in order to then be able to shift and begin to speak about their experiences once they settled in Montreal. One of the things that we also came to realize was that with our survivors, it took many interviews for them to be able to recognize the importance of this post-war story. With one of our survivors, Ted, we interviewed him a number of times. We interviewed him then in the neighborhood. And then we had Ted accompany us to a few of our talks about Refugee Boulevard. And in each of these cases, there was an extensive period of time where he would speak about his Holocaust experience. But there was this one moment when we were doing a Jane's Walk, where Ted had accompanied us, and he started very briefly to speak about his Holocaust experience. And then within a few minutes said, but that's not what we're going to speak about today. We're going to speak about when we came here, when we settled in Montreal. And from all of us, myself, Anna, Stacy, and Eszter, we felt that this was kind of the moment where we could see that Ted had begun to recognize the value in these post-war stories. And so it took a little bit of effort to get our survivors to not only shift to speak about this specific period of their lives, but also then to get them to recognize the value in these stories and the importance of these stories, that their lives go beyond the Holocaust. Another challenge that we faced was related to the mapping of the tour. Now, Anna already spoke a little bit about this, but I'll just add to it. So every project faces the challenges of what to include and what to not include. But the reality in this kind of project is that while we were emphasizing themes and ideas and beautiful stories, once we would walk the tour, we were very limited in terms of which stories and how much time we had to share these stories between, say, one street and another street. So we had to time that, figure out how much time we have in terms of the walking distance, and then try to balance out the stories that are going to be able to share the ideas and the themes and all of that within that time frame. And that meant that some of our stories had to be kind of tightly edited to fit within the time frame, and others had to be, their voices were sped up so that we could manage to include the stories within the balancing of making sure that it fit from one corner of the street to the other corner of the street. And the last kind of little challenge I'll tell you about is related to the pandemic. So we launched this project in the fall of 2019, and in the spring of 2020, we were in a global pandemic. And one of the things that we decided to do at that moment was to create a virtual tour. And I'll share my screen and I'll show you the virtual tour. So it's located on our website. One of the things that we decided was that we would create this virtual component because nobody could leave home. And so we wanted people to be able to listen to the stories, but to also get a kind of visual sense of the neighborhood as if they were walking in this neighborhood. And at the time, Google had this tour builder that was free and relatively easy to use, very time consuming, but easy to build a tour. And so we did that with the help of a graduate student, an intern at Concordia. We built this virtual tour. And then within a year, Google ended component whereby this tour could be held. And so it is no longer a kind of interactive tour. In the past, you could click on some images, read a little bit, kind of stop the tour, scroll around the Google Maps to get a larger visual sense of what the neighborhood looks like. And that is no longer available because the tour builder is no longer available. And so what we did was we created a static recording of what the tour builder was like. And I mean, I would argue that it's perhaps not as engaging as what we had with the other component, but it is what we had available. And so you can click on it, you can listen to the stories and see the neighborhood. And while doing this, so you can click on it, listen to the stories, visualize the neighborhood. And one of the things that we're very kind of proud about this is that it does kind of allow more people to be able to access this. The reality is that not everybody can walk around the neighborhood for an hour or can get to the neighborhood. And so there's this visual kind of component. And I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it on to to Eszter, sorry.
Just to build on this other way of treating the story, we also have on our website what we call web storytellers. Those are people who came not through the War Orphan Project, but through family sponsorship, because we wanted to show other types of immigration too and their experiences, and we also wanted to show some French stories. And so those are little video clips kind of talking along the same themes, and that part of the project is still growing. We added several clips, several people to it this fall, and we'll continue adding it from the existing oral history collection of the Holocaust Museum. The other thing I wanted to kind of build on a little bit is what both Anna and Nancy mentioned is how survivors were kind of treated as these one-dimensional beings of symbols of suffering, and everybody concentrated on that part of their stories, survivors as well as researchers or the public. And with Refugee Boulevard, we managed to portray these people as whole beings with a lot of experiences, obviously with difficult experiences from the Holocaust, which are obviously large part of their identity and their being, but showing them also as having mundane experiences, playing sports, going out, enjoying food, dating, dancing. So all these things that also make up the immigration experience. And these are stories that have not really been told before, and they're very relatable, and they really turn these people into like relatable people. Young people who are just trying to figure out how to find their way around a new city and a new country and how to settle down. We also find that a lot of other testimony projects concentrate, and that's true of the museum's own testimony projects too, concentrate on individual survivors' accounts, and they don't really give kind of like a social story. So here what we did is to convey not only individual experiences, but a collective experience of survivor, and survival not just meaning they survived, they stayed alive after a genocide, but also the shared communal experience of immigrating, of reestablishing their lives, of building new relationships, of finding themselves in this new situation. Working with them also allowed us to glimpse into informal social places that had no written records. We couldn't find anything in the archives anywhere. And we found quite a number of them, and that's very interesting, and that's kind of like the hidden parts of the story. And I'm gonna also play a clip for you about a restaurant that was in somebody's home and that nobody knew about except for these few Hungarian survivors who are still alive and who would tell the story. So let me share my screen with the sound.
Not far from the Y, one block on Park Avenue, It's a big apartment. I recognize the house. A Jewish family, also immigrants, opened up a restaurant, Faludi. They were business oriented, and she cooked in her kitchen and had about 10 guys like myself. Both of us spoke Hungarian among the boys, and we used to eat there for supper. For $1, we had a meal.
Faludi's, the place Paul just described to you, was located in a second-floor apartment. Watch for the very last walk-up staircase before the gas station. The apartment number is 4527. Stop at the foot of the staircase once you have found it.
We used to go and eat there because it was Hungarian Jewish food and reasonable. It was, I believe, it may have been their living room after they finished the meal. It became their living room, actually. But they set up tables there, tables that seated anywhere from 4 to 6 people. So there weren't too many tables. There was a lot of other non-Hungarian Jewish people, that used to come there because it was like a Jewish cuisine, I always met somebody that I knew there. There was always somebody that I knew.
Did you find the last staircase? Look up to the second-floor apartment at 4527. This was Faludi's, where survivors came to find nourishment, community, and a taste of
Home. So this really illustrates well, and we had other instances of that, of people describing the clubs that don't exist anymore, that we couldn't even quite locate because one said it was here, one said it was there. So this is very interesting. And through this project, I think that we filled a gap in the written history of the Holocaust, which rarely extends beyond the Holocaust to stories of immigration. And people usually don't see Holocaust survivor stories as an immigration story, but we do think it is an immigration story as well. And this can, we can connect these stories to the story of other immigrant communities in Montreal. To date, we won 2 awards with Refugee Boulevard. One is the Canadian Historical Association Prize in Public History, and the other one is the US Oral History Association Mason Multimedia Award. And I don't think we won anything else, Nancy and Anna, that I forgot. No. Okay. I don't know if you want to add anything before we open the floor for questions.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. This is wonderful. I want